Yes, I have everything
I have mixed emotions about the evening because really, when I started to reread Bob's book, Babe, I wanted to get up and start talking about it myself, but that would not be played by the rules. It would take me back, and I'm sure his talk will, to the wonderful days that I spent the many hours at the stadium with my grandfather, waiting for Babe Ruth to hit one more out of the park. That was always the high point of the game. Just to let you know what his book has done, Babe, The Legend Comes to Life. This was first published in 1974. Then it came out in a Penguin book edition in 1983. It was reprinted in 1983, in 84, in 85, 2 times in 86, 1988. So it's really a heck of a book. And now I'd like you to welcome Mr. Robert W. Creamer.
I have a whole bunch of notes here, and the main reason is not to remind me of things to say, but to remind me not to go off too long on any one tangent, because there's so much about Ruth, and I'm a Babe Ruth bore. I get talking about him and I can't stop. I noticed in the card that Fred sent out, he said I was going to talk about the continuing hold that Ruth has, and I'm fascinated by that, this hold that Babe Ruth has on the American imagination. It's really astonishing. When I wrote my book 20 years ago, it was published 20 years ago this August, I marveled then at the attention Ruth was getting. He'd been dead for more than 25 years, and it was nearly 40 years since he had last played a major league game. Yet almost every day back then, certainly several times a week, you heard his name, you read it, you saw it. It kept coming up. Sometimes it got very comical. Willie Sutton was a famous bank robber back then, and when he got out of prison, Time magazine saluted him by calling him the Babe Ruth of bank robbers. New York Times did a story on opera singers, and they called Enrico Caruso the Babe Ruth of tenors. A press release I got in 1974 from California called a man named Chuck Stearns the Babe Ruth of water skiers. John Lahr, very good writer, acknowledging the help he got in writing the biography of his father, Bert Lahr, the comedian, called a woman at Alfred Knopf the Babe Ruth of copy editors. It went on and on. In those days, Life magazine was really big stuff, and for a photographer to get a picture on the cover of Life was a signal achievement. There was a photographer named Philippe Hausman, and he had his 100th Life cover that year. And he was very proud. He said, "This is the high point of my career. It has taken me 27 years to achieve this record. I like to think of it as the equal of or maybe superior to Babe Ruth's." A dozen or so years before that, 1961, Roger Maris broke the Babe's famous record of 60 home runs in 1 year. When Maris made a successful rush at the Babe's record, he got tremendous publicity. Every day, everybody was writing about Maris, talking about Roger Maris this and Roger Maris that. It was unbelievable how much attention he got. Yet a decade or so later, when I was doing my book, only a handful of people knew where Roger Maris was or what he was doing, or even cared. While tenors and bank robbers and water skiers and God knows who all else was still being compared to an indefinable measure of superiority called Babe Ruth. Now, 1974 is also the year that Henry Aaron broke Babe Ruth's career record of 714 home runs, and it could be said that Henry's accomplishment focused attention on Babe that year. But here it is 20 years later, and while Henry Aaron is a revered and highly respected figure in baseball's pantheon of heroes, you don't hear his name all the time. You don't feel his presence. But the Babe, he's still all over the place. A couple of years ago, they made not one, but 2 movies about Babe Ruth. One made for television with Stephen Lang, a very good actor who lives up in Mount Kisco, playing Babe, and the other for the movie theaters with John Goodman waddling around the bases. Of course, they've made several TV movies or TV shows about Amy Fisher, and she was in the headlines, but they made those 2 movies about Babe 56 years after he played his last home run. I'd like to see Amy Fisher top that. Just the other day, I received an invitation from Hofstra University out on the island. It's an invitation sent out apparently to quite a few people to join in an academic symposium to be held next year, 1995, on the subject of Babe Ruth. Can you imagine that? Hofstra's an excellent school, highly rated academically, and they're putting their scholarly skills to work on the subject of Babe Ruth. It's now more than 45 years since Babe died, almost 60 since he last played a game. Other sports heroes come and go and eventually kind of fade into the mist of time. But the Babe, he's still here. He's in a picture upstairs. He was on the TV screen. He's all around us. Else, why are we here tonight? Okay, Babe Ruth. He was born in the middle of the 1890s in the middle of Baltimore, near the waterfront, rough section of town. At least at that time. It's been gentrified since. His father, George Ruth, was a saloon keeper. His mother helped in the bar. They lived upstairs over the saloon. The Babe was their first child, and they named him George Ruth Jr., after the father, the George Herman Ruth Jr. Their background was pretty much German. He was called Little George by the family. His father was called Big George. Ruth's mother had 7 more children after Babe. I should say she gave birth to 7 more children. 6 of them died, either at birth or shortly thereafter. Only one of them survived, and that was Babe's little sister, Mamie. Her real name was Mary Margaret, but she was always called Mamie, who was born in 1900 when Babe was 6 years old. I want to say something about Mamie. I talked to her when I was researching my book, and I met her again later in Baltimore at the Babe Ruth Museum a couple of times. She was a little tiny woman, not even 5 feet tall, but she resembled the Babe. She had the same sort of wide face and kind of flattish nose. Well, meeting Mamie made me understand the charm that Ruth must have had. He did dumb things, boorish things, could be loud, aggressive, vulgar, obscene. Yet when I spoke with old-time players, people who had known him, they all smiled when they started to think back about Ruth, remembering him fondly. I kept trying to get an adverse opinion. I threw a curveball question at an old-time ball player, Bob Shawkey, who had told me some startling stories about Ruth's behavior, outlandish behavior, and who I thought had good reason to dislike the Babe. So I said, why did some people dislike Ruth? And he almost jumped. He said, dislike him? He said, a lot of people got mad at him, but I never heard of anybody who didn't like Babe Ruth. When I met Mamie, I began to understand why. There was a quality. Some people have it. My wife's father has it, and her brother has it. It's hard to identify, but people just like them. It's fun to be around them. As long as I'm digressing, I should get something straight here about Babe Ruth's age. I said he was 6 in 1900 when Mamie was born. Well, Ruth always assumed that he'd been born on February 7th, 1894, and he used that date all his life. When he was 40, after the 1934 season, he was planning a trip abroad to Japan and then on around the world, and he needed a passport. So he needed a birth certificate for the passport, so he sent down to Baltimore for it. And when it came up, it didn't say George Herman Ruth Jr., born February 7th, 1894. It said baby boy Ruth, born February 6th, 1895, a year later and a day earlier. People laughed and said to Babe, hey, you're a year younger than you think you are. Babe said, what difference does it make? He didn't change. He continued to celebrate his birthday on February 7th. That was his birthday, and he wasn't going to change it for anybody. And he never took the year off his age. And it's possible that the 1895 date was wrong, or that the 1894 date is correct. The 1895 birth certificate could have been for one of Kate Ruth's children who died in early infancy. Nonetheless, the 1895 date has come to be accepted as birth date. And this invitation I got from Hofstra says a symposium next year is to honor Babe Ruth's 100th birthday on February 6, 1995. If Babe were alive, he'd probably growl, the hell with that. My 100th birthday is this year, February 7th. In any case, throughout my book and in this talk, I use the earlier date as the date of Ruth's age, because that's what he thought he was all this time. So he was 6 when Mamie was born. Now, Babe Ruth as a small child was a hellraiser, a holy terror. We all know the behavior of 2-year-old children, the things they do, the things they can get into the moment your back is turned, the trouble they can get into. Well, Babe Ruth was the Babe Ruth of little children who got into trouble. He was incredibly energetic, incredibly restless, always doing things he shouldn't do, taking things that didn't belong to him, constantly getting into trouble. And as he got older, he got worse. When he was 6 or 7, he began running with rough kids. He stole fruit and vegetables from neighborhood stores, threw them at truck drivers, ran and hid from the police, played hooky from school. He was an ungovernable child. driven by some inward force that he had all his life, a need to just do things and to keep on doing them without much sense of what others felt or thought. John Drebinger, the old New York Times sports writer, told me that Ruth was the most uninhibited human being he had ever met. He just did things, Drebinger said. Well, in 1902, when he was 8, with his father busy trying to make the saloon go, his mother often sick, trying to help at the bar while at the same time keeping an eye on little Mamie, who is now almost 2 herself, the Ruths threw up their hands and had their misbehaving 8-year-old son placed in St. Mary's Industrial School for Boys, an institution run by the Christian Brothers in Baltimore. St. Mary's was usually called a home in Baltimore. It was partly a reform school for kids like Ruth, partly an orphanage, partly a refuge for boys whose families had been torn apart by death or illness or drunkenness, and partly what its name said it was, an industrial training school where boys learned a trade. Ruth himself learned to be a tailor, and he was a pretty good one. His second wife said that Babe liked expensive silk shirts, and when the collars eventually frayed on his silk shirts, the Babe, at the peak of his career, earning a salary far above that of anyone else in baseball, would sit down at a sewing machine and turn the collars himself. Very skillful man. St. Mary's had high gates and iron fences, and in a real sense it was a prison for young Ruth and the other boys. The boys in the school, with wry humor, called themselves inmates, and when they were released to their families, they called it being paroled. Ruth was paroled to his family a few times, but he always got in trouble again and was popped back into the school. As a result, from the time he was 10 in 1904 until he was finally released for good just after his 20th birthday in 1914, he spent most of his boyhood and teenage years inside the gates of St. Mary's. There were about 800 boys in the school, and their favorite recreation was baseball, which they played in these big yard-like playgrounds they had. Basketball and football were seasonal pastimes like sliding on ice or throwing snowballs, something to do between the end of the baseball season in the fall and the beginning of baseball again in the early spring. From the first warm day in March all the way through into October, just about everybody in the school played baseball every day they could. And I mean hardball. Softball didn't become widespread as a substitute for baseball until the mid-1930s. At St. Mary's, there were more than 40 organized baseball teams at all age levels. As Ruth grew up, he developed into the best player in the school. First as a left-handed catcher, later as a left-handed pitcher. He was a superb pitcher, even at that age. Casey Stengel, when he was a young outfielder with the Brooklyn Dodgers, batted against Ruth in an exhibition game before Ruth got to the majors. Casey said he had good stuff, a good fastball, a fine curve, a dipsy-do that made you think a little. It's rare for a young pitcher to have both a fastball and a curve. Ruth had them. The best teams at St. Mary's, the ones Ruth played on, often played outside the school, playing different teams around Baltimore. Ruth was big, 6'2", 195 pounds by the time he left the school, and his reputation as a pitcher spread. At that time, there were only 15 major league teams in existence, 16 rather, and there was no television or radio to broadcast their games throughout the country. Fans in non-major league cities rooted for the local minor league teams, and minor league baseball was therefore important. Most of the teams were independently owned, independent of major league control, and the owners of the teams made a good part of their money by finding, developing, and selling outstanding players to the major leagues. The Baltimore Orioles at that time, who were a minor league club in the National League, and their owner-manager was a man named Jack Dunn. Dunn had heard about young Ruth, and in February 1914, the month Ruth reached the age of 20, Dunn went to St. Mary's, talked things over with the Christian Brothers and with Ruth, and signed the boy to a professional contract for $600 for the season. Later that year, as Ruth proved his ability, Dunn raised him to $1,200 and then to $1,800 for the year. Ruth left St. Mary's. A notation in the school ledger said he is going to join the Baltimore baseball team on Friday, February 27th, spent the weekend with his family, and on Monday, March 2nd, joined several other players and took an overnight train south to Fayetteville, North Carolina, to his first spring training camp. I'm being specific about those dates for a reason, because there's something that happened that first week in Fayetteville, which set the tone for his fabulous career. It rained most of the week. They barely worked out at all Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Just threw a ball back and forth once or twice. But Saturday was beautiful, sunny and warm, the field dried out, and the Orioles were able to play an intra-squad game, their first baseball game of the spring. It was an inconsequential game which would be of no interest or significance except for one thing. In the second inning, Ruth, coming to bat for the second time, hit a home run, the first he ever hit as a professional ball player. That's not the point. That's not the significance. It was the way he hit it. In a Baltimore newspaper, the next day, there was an account of the game and the homer by a sports writer who was covering the Orioles in spring training. He wrote, "The next batter made a hit that will live in the memory of all who saw it. That clouder was George Ruth, the southpaw from St. Mary's School. The ball carried so far to right field that he walked around the bases." Ruth crossed home plate before the right fielder retrieved the ball from the cornfield beyond the playing field. The Fayetteville fans, those at the game and those who heard about the homer, were astounded. Several years before, Jim Thorpe, the great Indian athlete, had played for the Fayetteville team in the Carolina League. And one day he had hit a tremendous home run that Fayetteville fans loved to tell visiting major leaguers about because he'd hit it so far. Thorpe's mammoth homer was by far the longest ever seen at the local ball field. And now this green rookie from Baltimore had hit a ball that went 60 feet farther than Thorpe's did. Headlines in the Baltimore papers the next day said, "Homer by Ruth, feature of game. Ruth makes mighty clout." It was just over a week since he had left St. Mary's. It was his first game as a professional, the second inning, his second at-bat, and he had thrilled the hell out of everybody. This, I think, is the first key to understand Ruth's phenomenal hold on our imagination. He just did fabulous things. He was in camp as a rookie pitcher, yet he hit this tremendous home run. He began pitching in spring training, had a little trouble at first, then went against the powerful Philadelphia Athletics, the best team in baseball then, World Series champions the year before, pennant winners again that year. Ruth pitched a complete game against them and beat them 7-2. He was still George Ruth, but in a very short time that changed, and he picked up his indelible nickname, which added so much to his image. If his name had been, say, Harold Parker, I wonder if we would be here tonight. Babe Ruth has a ring to it. Anyway, in North Carolina, his name came about because while he was showing maturity on the baseball field, he was still a young kid off it, and his teammates were keenly aware of it. Today, minor league players are young, often very young. But in those days, minor league teams had lots of older players. Some were veteran minor leaguers, not quite good enough for the majors, who nonetheless could make a career, a better living playing minor league ball than working back home and behind a counter in a store. Others were ex-major leaguers who continued playing professional baseball in the minors for years before hanging up their spikes. Jack Dunn's Orioles was such a team, veterans. Most of the players were considerably older than Ruth and much more sophisticated. Many of them had played major league ball. Several were college men, well-mannered, intelligent, aware, nothing at all like the rough, unlettered boobs that Ring Lardner wrote about. These older players were amused by the youthful Ruth, but they had nothing in common with him except baseball. Ruth's friends were the kids in Fayetteville. He hung around with the kids. He rode their bicycles. When he received his first paycheck after the season began, the first thing he did was buy a bike. Now they'd buy a Mercedes. In Fayetteville, he'd spent hours riding up and down in the hotel elevator. He'd never seen one before. And he spent a lot of his spare time down at the railroad station, gaping at the big steam locomotives as they came in and out of town. To the older players, he was still a child, and they began referring to him as Jack Dunn's baby, or Babe. Babe was a common nickname in those days for a younger sibling, or an only child, or a small child. And in a very short time, George Ruth was called Babe by everybody on and around the team. When the Orioles returned to Baltimore to start the International League season, the George Ruth who had left town unknown less than 4 weeks earlier was now the famous rookie Babe Ruth, with his picture in the papers along with stories urging Baltimoreans to come out and watch him pitch. He was still a kid, still showing the exuberance that never left him, thank God. Just before the season began, the Orioles played an exhibition game before a large crowd against John McGraw's famous New York Giants, and they won it 2-1. The Oriole first baseman was slightly injured late in the game, and Dunn sent Ruth, tall, left-handed ball player, very graceful, out to play first base in the ninth inning. The last out of the close game was a ground ball that was thrown to Ruth at first base. Overjoyed at the realization that his team had defeated the great McGraw and the Giants, Ruth whooped with pleasure and threw the ball high across the field into the bleachers along the left field foul line. Things like that weren't done in those days. Baseballs were expensive. Foul balls hit into the stands or tossed back onto the field to continue in use. Ruth's triumphant gesture was extravagant, and the fans loved it. Ruth's lifelong love affair with the crowd may have begun that afternoon, or the crowd's lifelong love affair with Babe may have started that same day. He always reacted to the crowd, played to it, was aware of it. 14 years later, when the Yankees swept the 1928 World Series from the St. Louis Cardinals, Ruth had a ball with the St. Louis crowd. Twice during one game, as he took, the fourth game of the series, twice during that game as he took his place in left field, the position he usually played in the road, the crowd booed him cheerfully. You can boo cheerfully. People booed Ruth cheerfully a lot. And he loved it. He'd grin back up at him and make remarks, make gestures. This time, hearing the boos, Ruth grinned up at the people in the stands, pointed to right field, and made swinging gestures with the bat, meaning, next time I'm up, I'm going to pop one. And he did. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. The second time, he did 3 home runs in one World Series game, the record that Reggie Jackson tied many, many years later. Then, in the last half of the 9th inning of this final game of the World Series, with the Yankees ahead, the Cardinals tried to rally, but with 2 outs, the last batter hit a foul fly down the left field line, where extra seats had been put out to accommodate the overflow crowd. Ruth ran in along the temporary fence, and with St. Louis fans whacking at him with programs to keep him from catching the ball, he reached above their heads and deftly plucked the ball out of the air. And then he held his glove with the ball high in the air like a trophy as he ran in towards the dugout and off the field. Enemy territory, enemy crowd, but the fans loved it. They remembered it. That was Babe Ruth. Back to 1914 for a moment. He had a tremendous season. He pitched only 3 months with the Orioles and yet won 14 games in less than half a season before he was sold to the Boston Red Sox in July. He pitched a little for the Sox, sat on the bench for a while, and then in August was sent back to the minors to Providence in the International League for seasoning. He won 9 games in little more than a month for Providence. And at the end of September, went back up to the Red Sox to stay. All in all, that year, in 1914, pitching for Baltimore, Providence, and Boston, Babe Ruth won 25 games and lost only 9, an amazing performance for a rookie, particularly considering that he didn't pitch at all for a month in mid-season when he was sitting on the bench for the Red Sox. Anyway, now he was a full-fledged major leaguer, and with Boston, he quickly became the best left-handed pitcher in baseball, or at least in the American League, if not in baseball. He won 18 games in 1915, 23 in 1916, 24 in 1917. In the 1916 World Series, he pitched and won a 14-inning game 2-1, which is still the longest World Series game ever played. He didn't allow a run over the last 13 innings. In the 1918 World Series, he pitched a shutout and then won a second game in which he extended his streak of scoreless innings to 29, a record that stood unbroken for more than 40 years. He was a great pitcher. He was like a Doc Gooden or a Roger Clemens or a Nolan Ryan, the best. But during the 1918 season, he started to switch over from being a pitcher to being a full-time hitter, an outfielder. He wanted to make the change. His manager didn't want him to change. The manager wanted Ruth to be a pitcher only. The two squabbled and argued and fought, and at one point, Ruth quit, jumped the team, refused to play at all. The Red Sox were fighting for the pennant, and they desperately needed Ruth's pitching skills, as well as his bat. So he and the manager finally worked out a compromise. Ruth could play the outfield and bat cleanup, but when his turn came to pitch, he took the mound and pitched, still hitting fourth. He did this, pitching and hitting both, through the last 5 weeks of the season, and the Red Sox won the pennant in the World Series. Ruth won 13 games in all, as well as his first home run championship. If ever there was the most valuable player, it was Babe Ruth in 1918. In 1919, he still pitched a little for the Red Sox, but now at last he was primarily a hitter, and immediately broke all existing records for home runs in one season. He hit 29, which doesn't seem like much today. But the American League record had been only 16, and the second best total behind Ruth in 1919 was only 10. So 29 home runs was an enormous figure. It seemed phenomenal. Ruth was a national figure, and that is why, 3 months later, during the winter, when the Red Sox, with no warning, sold Babe Ruth to the New York Yankees, it was the most stunning deal in baseball history. In New York, Ruth just took off. He had 54 homers in 1920 and topped that with 59 in 1921, and he was still doing it with panache, with brio, with elan, with all those hokey adjectives that mean he was something to watch. In one game in 1919, when he was still with the Red Sox, he faced Lefty Williams of Chicago, a terrific pitcher himself who won 23 games that year. At that point, Ruth needed one more home run to tie an ancient home run record set almost 40 years earlier, a fluke record set in a small park, but nonetheless the one last mark he had to reach and pass to become the unquestioned home run king of all time. The Red Sox, trying to pump up attendance, said that there would be a doubleheader that day, that it would be Babe Ruth Day in Fenway Park, and that the Babe himself would pitch the first game against Lefty Williams. The promotion worked. The ballpark was packed. But Babe was a little disappointing as a pitcher, lasting only into the sixth before giving way to a relief pitcher. But he didn't leave the game. He switched to left field. And in the last of the ninth, Ruth, a lefty batter facing a superb left-handed pitcher, hit a huge home run to left field, where in those days a left-handed batter wasn't supposed to hit home runs. It won the game, tied the ancient home run record, which he broke a day or so later, and absolutely delighted the crowd and even awed his fellow players. After the game, the Chicago third baseman came by the Red Sox dugout and said, "That was the most unbelievable poke I ever saw." He was still doing it. With the Yankees, he showed the same dash, the same sense of the dramatic, the exciting. In the 1921 World Series, the first of the famous Subway Series that fascinated New Yorkers in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, the Yankees won the first two games. But Ruth had little to do with the victories. The Giants were pitching him very carefully. In the second game, he walked 3 straight times, which was as frustrating to Ruth as it was to the fans. I would come to see him do something spectacular. After the third walk, almost as though he couldn't stand the inaction anymore, he suddenly bolted for second base and stole it standing up. That shook up the Giants and the crowd too. And then, to top it off, he took off for third and stole that one too, which really shook up the place. That's one of the reasons, the fact that Ruth could steal 2 bases in the World Series, that I so disliked the John Goodman movie about Babe Ruth. And the other one, with the Stephen Lang movie, Lang was lean and hard and athletic in the early scenes and added weight with padding and so forth for the later scenes. In the Goodman movie, they had the Babe coming to St. Mary's as a little fat kid people made fun of. But he wasn't fat, not until he got older. And even then he could move with grace and speed and coordination. Next fall, be sure to watch Ken Burns' baseball series on PBS. He's the man who made that marvelous Civil War series a few years ago. Now he's doing the same thing with baseball. So it'll be maybe 12, maybe more than that episode. It's pretty impressive. I've seen some of it. In it, he has old film footage of Ruth, something like the stuff we have here. And along with the usual pictures of the Babe hitting a home run and trotting around the bases and that little pity-pat step he had, Burns has shots of Ruth stretching a single into a double, running hard, and zipping safely into the base with a terrific slide. Ruth wasn't the obese, wolfish slob that Goodman, an actor I've otherwise admired, made him out to be. He was a graceful, beautifully coordinated athlete. And the fact that he could play so well even after he developed that paunch is evidence of that. Ruth kept on doing things. He got in trouble. He was suspended 5 different times during the 1922 season, which I think is a major league record. It was for behavior that baseball objected to, usually bad-mouthing umpires, although once he climbed into the stands chasing after an abusive fan. In 1925, with his first marriage collapsing and newspapermen hounding him about his affair with the woman who became his second wife, he drank too much, slept too little, got terribly sick, missed a good part of the season, fought with his manager when he returned, was suspended, and hit with the biggest fine a player had ever had up to that time. It was $5,000, which seems like peanuts to athletes today, but Major League ball players made $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a year. It was an enormous fine. A lot of people thought the Babe was washed up now that he was past 30 and in such bad physical shape. He reformed. And from 1926 through 1931, when he was 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37 years old, he put on the greatest sustained streak of power hitting that baseball has ever seen, or I'd bet the farm on this will ever see again. Everyone knows he hit 60 home runs in 1927. But how many know that from 1926 to 1931, he averaged more than 50 home runs a season? Except for 1922 and 1925, his trouble years, he won the American League Home Run Championship every year from 1918 to 1931, 12 times in 14 seasons. But it was more than home runs. Ruth was a fine fielder with a great throwing arm. He could play left field, right field, first base. He stole 135 bases in his career. Lou Gehrig stole only 102. Joe DiMaggio only 30. Ted Williams, 24. They were raving this past season about Speedy Lenny Dykstra of the Phillies, scoring, 135 runs? Old pot-bellied Babe scampered around the bases fast enough to score 158 runs in 1927, 163 in 1928, 150 in 1930. He was a piece of work. He began slowing down in 1932, although he still hit 41 homers. But he suffered an appendix attack late in the season, and they thought he'd have to miss the World Series against the Cubs. After all, he was 38. But he was in the lineup anyway when the season began, played every game, batted .333, drove in 6 runs, and hit 2 homers in one game. One of them, the most famous homer he ever hit, the famous Call Shot home run, in which he defied the Chicago crowd and the bench jockeying Cubs, indicated he was going to belt one, and proceeded to hit the longest home run that up to that time had ever been hit in Wrigley Field. What a moment. Yet Ruth, trotting around the bases, laughing at the Cubs, was saying to himself, "You lucky stiff, you lucky, lucky stiff." He was aware of things. He understood things. A couple of more fading years with the Yankees. Then one last sad year, it's a sad hurrah with the old Boston Braves. He had a great opening day with the Braves in 1935, rising to the occasion before a large opening day crowd, hit a home run off the great Carl Hubbell as Boston won. But then things went sour, and he wanted to retire. Persuaded by the Braves president to make one last road trip with the club, he complied out of a sense of duty. His wife said, "Why don't you quit?" And he said, "I promised the son of a bitch I'd make the trip." Aching, his eyes hurting, his batting average down to a miserable 155, he reached Pittsburgh, and the last game there, he hit 3 home runs and a single. His last home run, a monumental drive over the roof in right field, the first time a ball had ever been hit over the right field roof in Pittsburgh. The pitcher he hit it off said later, "I never saw a ball hit so hard before or since." He said he was fat and old, but he still had that great swing. Even when he missed, you could hear the bat swish. I can't remember anything else about the other home runs of his that day, but I can't forget that last one. It's probably still going. What a way to end a marvelous career. It was the last home run he ever hit and the last base hit he ever had. A few days later in Philadelphia, he played his final game, then packed it in for good. For all his carefree, uninhibited ways, and that's why I sort of made this note-like speech, because I didn't want to go off in too many tangents and spend 4 hours talking about Ruth and his adventures. He never lost the sense that he had an obligation to his role as a hero or whatever. He had a sense of class, of knowing what to do at the right time. Like most baseball players, he was very obscene in his casual speech. Yet Ford Frick, the old baseball commissioner, told me that while Ruth's language was pretty bad, Frick said, "Whenever my wife was with us, I cannot recall one instance when Babe ever said anything crude, anything obscene." When Ruth was very ill, a year or so before he died, but still moving around, he was staying in a suite in a Cincinnati hotel when Waite Hoyt, the old pitcher and a good friend of Babe's, came to see him. Hoyt brought along his wife, whom he had married only recently. They stayed only a short time, Hoyt said, because Ruth was obviously not feeling well. When they started to leave, Ruth said, "Wait a minute." And he got up painfully and went into the kitchen of the suite to the refrigerator and brought back a small vase with an orchid in it. "Here," he said to Hoyt's wife, "I never gave you anything." I think it's a great gesture. He still had that sense of duty, of responsibility, even when he was close to death in 1948. Because he had promised he would, he left his hospital room to attend the premiere of that 1948 Babe Ruth movie, starring William Bendix, which was even worse than the John Goodman movie. Once the movie began, Ruth grew very uncomfortable, and he left before it was over. Back in the hospital, he seemed content and never left it again. "All my obligations are over," he said. "I'm going to rest now." He died 3 weeks later. He was the best baseball player who ever lived. He was better than Ty Cobb. He was better than Willie Mays, better than Joe DiMaggio, better than Ted Williams, better than Henry Aaron, better than Barry Bonds. There is no question about it. He was a great pitcher and a great hitter and a fabulous person. There has never been anybody else like him. And that's why we're here tonight. Thank you. Fred said it's just possible some people might have questions. And no one's going, in the back.
First, I want to ask, how did he stay out of World War I?
Well, he got married very young. And at the end of that first season, 1914, he had met Helen Woodford in Boston. She worked behind the counter of a place where he ate breakfast all the time. And towards the end of the season, his first year, he's 20 years old, he said, "Hey, hon, how about getting married?" So they eloped to Baltimore and were married there. So he was a married man when the war began. And he just stayed out of it that way.
And did he really hate Lou Gehrig, or is that a myth?
Hate Lou Gehrig?
No.
This is complicated. First, Ruth was in the major leagues for 10 years before Gehrig came up. He was just a kid, a rookie. And Ruth was always friendly with rookies. He always had this habit. Mickey Mantle was the same way, nice to young players. And Gehrig and he, the first few years, were good buddies. They went fishing together. There are fabulous photographs of them fishing out in Sheepshead Bay, places like that. And Ruth took Gehrig with him on barnstorming trips after the season was over. He'd make a lot of money in the postseason play then because people didn't see ball players, no television. And this gave him a chance to see them in the small towns. And Ruth once said to Gehrig, "Hey, Buster," he said, "isn't it true you made more money barnstorming with me than you made during the season?" And Gehrig said, "Yeah, that's right." So they were good friends. But the story is that when Ruth married his second wife, she had had a daughter by her first marriage. Ruth had a daughter, an adopted daughter, by his first marriage. And Ruth and Claire cross-adopted each other's children. So they're two girls. Well, Claire's daughter, Julia, was much older than Dorothy and was quite a young lady. She dressed beautifully and she was a little sophisticated, whereas Dorothy was kind of a 12-year-old tomboy or 11-year-old tomboy. Ruth used to go up to Pelham, or New Rochelle, I forget which, where Lou Gehrig's mother lived. And he'd bring Dorothy with him. And Dorothy loved to go up there, and so did Babe. Mrs. Gehrig was an old German woman and made cakes and stuff, and Ruth liked it. But she was also kind of a nosy, busybody old German woman. And she said to someone looking at Dorothy with these old beat-up clothes on, the grungy look before the grungy look was in, and she said, "You think she'd dress his daughter the way she dresses her own daughter?" And this got back to Claire, and she got furious, and she yelled at Babe, and Babe, next day in the ballpark, said to Gehrig, "Why don't you tell your mother to mind her own business?" And you couldn't say that to Lou about his mother, so they didn't speak after that, until Gehrig was dying, and Ruth put his arm around his shoulder. So that's the story of that. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you could touch on the batting averages that Babe
Well, he had
during his great home run years, because usually home run hitters have notoriously mediocre or low batting average.
Well, batting averages were generally higher during Ruth's career, at least during the 20s and 30s. But he was a very high average hitter. He won the batting championship one year. Another year, I think he hit .390 and didn't win the championship.
342 was his lifetime. Gehrig's was 340, right on the nose.
Very good. Salute. He was a high average hitter.
Hitting for a slugger.
He used to claim that if he tried to go for singles, he could have hit 500. I think he might have. He never won the Triple Crown, which was batting average, home runs, and runs batted in. But he won 2/3 of the Triple Crown several times. Batting average and home runs, or runs batted in and home runs, and things like that. He was a high average hitter. In my book someplace, I talked about an old film clip I'd seen of Ruth in batting practice. And I think Ken Burns has this in his film too. Just in a sweatshirt, just swinging like this, just hitting grounders. And it's so pretty to watch, the control he has of the bat. You're not trying to pull it out of the ballpark, just bringing it back and swinging it through. He had a beautiful swing. I mentioned to Joe Jablonowiski, our cameraman, that the name Jablonowiski appears in the first page of my Babe Ruth book. This was an anecdote from an old American League pitcher who was called Pete Appleton. Pete Appleton was talking about Babe Ruth during his last years when Pete was with the Yankees for a time. And he said, Ruth, for all his carousing and all his chasing around, was kind of a lonesome man. And he'd be in the road and he'd call downstairs to the lobby and say, "Would you page the lobby and see if there are any Yankee players down there?" And Jablonowiski was there, so Jablonowiski was there, Appleton, and he took the call. And Ruth said, "Hey, kid, how about coming up and playing some cards?" He was just a lonely man in a hotel room. And Appleton, in talking about him, said, but he was still the best. He said he had the loveliest, the prettiest swing of all. And I thought, what a description, this massive man who hit home runs, this pretty swing. And his home runs were not hit with bulk. They were hit with grace. It was coordination, just bing, like that. Like hitting a golf ball the right way. Very interesting man. Yes?
Can you project Babe Ruth from that time into today? How different would it be with the
I have been asked that question fairly often. It's amazing how many people want to figure it out. And I finally, after giving lots of dumb answers, I thought, I'll try to answer, but it's almost impossible to answer because it's such a different world. Ruth wasn't protected, you know, but a lot of people believe that the sports writers protected him because he did so many things. But it wasn't that. It was that in those days, the newspapers were the prime source of information. I mean, people, there was, 7 or 8 editions of a paper a day. You came home in the afternoon, got the afternoon paper to see what happened that day. You didn't turn on the news. You got the paper in the morning to find what happened in the ball game. You didn't hear it in radio usually. You didn't see it in television, so you read these long accounts. The sports writers were writing a lead for the first edition, another one for the second edition, a game story for the third, a feature for the fourth. They were working all the time. They didn't have time for the gossipy stories, which are the essence of sports coverage today. I mean, almost all sports writers are gossip writers now. I mean, they don't have much choice because television and radio give us the news. So when Ruth did get in trouble, boy, there was lots of detail. Pictures of him being carried out in a stretcher, pictures of him when he came back from being fined, trying to make up with his wife. So I don't know how he'd handle it today. He'd be under much more pressure, and he might have had a few fights with sports writers. I don't know. But in those days, he got along beautifully with sports writers. They loved him. Photographers loved him. He'd pose for anybody, any place at all. But people also ask, how could he have played today? Obviously, the competition in baseball is much superior to what it was back then. I mean, in the 20s and 30s when Ruth was playing, there were no black ball players in the major leagues because of that stupid color line. And you know that there must have been a tremendous amount of great athletes. So he didn't have that kind of pressure competition. But I think, any case, he would have been just as good a ball player then as he is now. I mean, now as he was then. He was extraordinary. He was an absolute phenomenon. Somebody had a hand up over here.
Could you describe his funeral at Yankee Stadium?
No, I didn't. I deliberately didn't when I was doing my book. There was so much about the casket being laid out in Yankee Stadium and thousands coming by it, and then the funeral in St. Patrick's on a hot day, and the story of Wade Hoyt and Joe Dugan watching the casket being taken out, and one of them said to the other, boy, I could use a beer, and the other one said, so could the babe. But these stories have been told so many times, and I thought, these are after the babe. And I had a great story from Ford Frick, who was not that, colorful a man or that rich in prose and things, but he was talking about Ruth when he was sick, and how someone called Frick and said, Babe wants to see you. And so he went down to the hospital, he said, and he said hello to Claire, who was in the death watch across the hall, and he went to see Babe, and Frick said it was a terrible moment. He said Ruth was so thin, his arms were like sticks, and his face was drawn, and he could hardly talk, and he just sort of lifted his arm up like this and said, Ford, he said, I'm always glad to see you. And Frick said it was just something polite to say. He said, we talked for a few minutes, and I left. And I said goodbye across the hall, and I went home, and the next day he was dead. And when I was typing that, you put little notes up on the bulletin board as you write, and you take things down to get them for your story, and I wrote that, and I got, he was dead. And I remember consciously thinking, oh, that's the end of the book. So I ended it when Ruth died. And I hadn't paid attention to his funeral. He wasn't there. Mr. Crichton.
I once asked you, perhaps you know the answer to that, but when Babe was playing outfield and pitching, did he ever have a sore arm, and how did he ever throw the ball in the next day after pitching a full game? Left field.
Well, to my knowledge, he never had a sore arm. He had a very easy way of throwing, very loose and graceful, so he wasn't constantly pounding his arm. It was easier to pitch in those days because you might have 2 or 3 really good hitters in the lineup, and a lot of guys were just punching little singles here and there. In fact, that game I mentioned when Ruth was a rookie in spring training, when he beat the Philadelphia Athletics 2-1, pitched a complete game, he gave up 13 hits and 1 run. So it was easier to pitch. You didn't have to bear down as much. And I guess, I don't know, when I was a kid, guys pitched and played the outfield. I think the difference in effort wasn't that much. Now it's such an incredible effort all the time. Sir, back there. No, you.
You mentioned earlier that Ruth only played left field on the road. And I was just wondering why he didn't play left field at Yankee Stadium.
He didn't play the sun field. In Yankee Stadium, the sun shines in the left fielder's eyes, and for some reason, most ballparks on the road in those days, it shone in the right fielder's eyes. So they wanted to keep Babe away from the sun. wanted his eyes to be used, and that's the reason.
Why
Some,
did they want to keep him with?
because the sun was glaring in his eyes, and that would hurt his eyes, and he wouldn't hit as well. Yes?
Speaking of his eyes, is there any truth to the story that he had particularly good, keen eyesight?
Well, to tell you the truth, I don't know. I've heard that story, and he must have. I mean, must have. Great athletes, my friend Crichton has pointed this out, great athletes have amazing eyes. You just look at them, they seem to almost bulge out of their heads. They're really good ones. They're always looking this way and that way. The Chicago Bears middle linebacker who just retired, Mike Singletary, you see him like that, and those eyes were like two beams coming out. And Ruth had big eyes. You could see them all over the place in those pictures going like that. He must have had extraordinary eyesight. I know Ted Williams did have his eyes measured.
Do you have anything to say about the spiraling player salaries and the possible realignment of the leagues?
Well,
like this?
yeah. I try not to be an old curmudgeon. If I had my way, we'd go back to 8 teams in the American League, 8 in the National, all up in this part of the country, and no night games, and 154-game season, and all that sort of stuff.
I have something from Joe DiMaggio.
Okay, I got to finish this.
About the salaries.
I got to finish this question for a second. But it's changed, and it's going to keep on changing. And the thing is that when I was a kid, if a team drew 1 million spectators in the season, that was tremendous. The Dodgers did it, I think, in 1940, and it was all headlines. Now, if a team draws 1 million people, it's dirt. They're going to move the club. So a lot more people are watching baseball now than they used to, and with television, a lot more are seeing the players. And with that, there's a lot more money coming in. Some years ago, there was a pitcher, I can't remember his name, and some sports writer kidded him about the money he was making. You know, are you worth $800,000 for being a relief pitcher, throwing 6 games a year or something? He said, heck no. He said, I'm not worth that, he said. If I got $60,000, $70,000, this was 10 years ago, I'd be happy with it. He said, but I'll tell you, you tell the owners to knock the ticket prices down, knock the concession prices down, knock the parking prices down, television not to pay as much in fees. He said, and I'll be glad to take a cut. But as long as the owners are getting it, he said, I want my share. And that's where it comes from. I don't think baseball players are overpaid at all. If they were, they wouldn't be getting it. Babe Ruth said that. When he was the highest paid player in baseball, he said, nobody gets paid more than they're worth. Maybe for a year they will, because the contracts weren't where they are now. He said, nobody gets paid more than he's worth. He said, and you better get all the money that's coming to you. And he got it. He was in some ways an ignorant man, but in other ways he was very shrewd, very bright, very smart. Sir?
Do you think in our lifetime we'll see a decent Babe Ruth movie?
No, I don't.
Why can't Hollywood handle it?
Well,
Is it too big, or can't we see it?
I think Hollywood lapses into cliche. The TV movie that Stephen Lang was in, I had hopes for. I was out in Los Angeles on a book tour, and I went out to Ontario, California, to watch them film some scenes, and I was watching Steve Lang. He was a very nice fellow, and he was hitting line drives. He'd really gotten to the point where he could whack them. They're getting shots for hitting home runs. And Lang had read my book, which flattered me, and he quoted things from it, and he had a sense of what Ruth was like. And I thought maybe they're going to do something. And the call shot home run, for instance, is a fabulous thing. I mean, I just did it in one sentence, but that was the most dramatic moment. And it wasn't William Bendix pointing like this or John Goodman or anybody else. It was the fact of conflict, with Ruth being on the firing line, with the Cubs yelling at him and the fans yelling at him. And Ruth had hit a home run in the first inning of that game. On deck, someone threw a lemon at him, and he looked and he just pointed up at the right field stands, and he hit a ball to the right field, over the right field fence. No one talks about that. But in the 4th or 5th inning, he had fumbled the ball in the outfield, trying to make a shoestring catch, and it led to the Cubs tying the game. And the Chicago crowd was hooting him and booing him. He was the first man up the next inning. And they were all over him. And the Chicago Cub trainer was calling me a big, fat-bellied so-and-so, and Ruth saying, I don't mind the players yelling at me, but no trainer should yell at me. And he was yelling back at them. I mean, under this tremendous pressure, and he was as relaxed as a eel, yelling at them, backing out, and he did this thing, holding one thing up. And what he said, no one's quite sure, but Gabby Hartnett, the catcher, said it only takes one to hit it, or I got one left. And then he hit the ball. And it wasn't just that he hit the homer, or to an exact spot, he hit it to the farthest part of the field. It was just a shocking home run. It was so obliterating, and the Chicago crowd was just stunned. Franklin Roosevelt was at that game. I found this in my research. It delighted me. He was with Tony Cermak, the mayor of Chicago, who was assassinated the following spring with Roosevelt in Florida. Roosevelt was almost killed. But Cermak and Roosevelt were sitting together, and they said when Ruth hit the home run and was going on the bases, Roosevelt just put his head back and laughed. It was that kind of a moment. Well, you talk to the movie people about this, and they say, yeah, and then finally comes out, and Steve Lang goes like that, and the same thing goes on. When they made the Bendix movie, Bob Considine, who wrote Ruth's autobiography, the original one, his autobiography in '48, went to Hollywood as a consultant. They paid him money to correct things in this movie. And they were doing these awful things. They were making up things, all the story. And Considine said, what are you doing this for? Why are you doing that? I had lunch with Considine. He told me this. He was very nice. And they said, well, he said, we're trying to make it exciting. And Considine said, why don't you look at his life? It was tremendously exciting. There were dramatic moments. There were rises and falls and everything. But to make a Babe Ruth movie, you have to appeal to a broad audience. And to appeal to a broad audience, you take the lowest common denominator, which is the way television works and the way movies work. And they're never going to do it. I thought we were going to do a show of Babe Ruth. Some years ago, a guy came to me, and we tried to write a script or a book, or you call it, for a musical. And he knew these two young songwriters, one from New Rochelle, Alan Menken, and Howard Ashman, this tall guy. And they wrote about 3 or 4 songs. So we went down to Menken's apartment where he lived with his wife, and Ashman came over, and Menken played the piano, and Ashman sang. And he had some terrific songs. But Ashman and my collaborator didn't get along. And it just didn't work out, and there was too many arguments, and finally the whole thing dropped. I thought Ashman had a keen sense of what Ruth was about. Ruth didn't want to be disciplined. He'd been in that home for all his early years, and he was such an explosive kid. When he got out, as one of the old ball players told me, he said he just wanted to explode. Nobody's going to hold him down again. And yet the baseball managers were trying to hold him down. Ed Barrow tried to keep him from being a hitter. The Yankees kept trying to keep him down. And he just kept rebelling against it. It was a rebellion against authority. And it wasn't, I guess, until he was fine that time, and Miller Huggins, maybe he just got older, and he finally realized, okay, he still raised it. Hell, off the field, he still chased women, he still drank, but on the field, there was no more trouble, and that's when he had his greatest years. Oh, you could make a great movie in Babe Ruth. Never will. Last night, there was a television movie with all the Bridges, Lloyd Bridges and his whole family, and there's an actor named Fred Coffin played, I guess, the ultimate villain, the murderer in this thing. Now I've told right the plot. And when it started, Margaret said, oh, Fred Coffin is in this. And he was a guy that my would-be collaborator said would be a perfect Babe Ruth when we went to see him in a couple of plays. And he was. He had a big face and he could move. He would have been great. But that's a long time ago. Yes?
Why didn't he ever manage, or why didn't they let him?
Well, that's the thing. They emphasize this too much in the movies that everybody wouldn't let him manage. He wanted to manage, but he wanted to manage a major league team. And he should have been allowed to. I mean, Ty Cobb did, Tris Speaker did, all these famous players. But there was, baseball has an awful lot of cliche thoughts. And you get all these great minds that run baseball, and they think the same way. And they get this thing in their mind that sticks there. And they said, if he can't manage himself, how can he manage a team? Well, that's just nonsense. No one knows ahead of time who makes a good baseball manager and who doesn't. When I was young, everybody thought Billy Herman was a great second baseman for the Cubs and the Dodgers would make a great manager. He was a bust as a manager. No one ever dreamed that Yogi Berra could manage, and he won 2 pennants. Or Hank Bauer, who won a world championship. No one knows. They didn't, Ruth had a chance to manage. The Detroit Tigers wanted to talk to him about managing, and he was going over to Japan, he said, or something, he was going to Hawaii or something. I'll see you when I get back. By the time he got back, the Tigers had hired somebody else. Connie Mack was thinking of hiring him to manage the Philadelphia Athletics. They went on that trip to Japan, and Claire Ruth went along, and she was kind of a busybody, and Mack said, if I make Ruth my manager, he said his wife will be running the ball club. So he didn't get to manage, and then in the middle 30s, a strange thing happened. The first 2 or 3 years he was out of baseball. Usually there are a lot of managers hired and fired every year, but there was suddenly a stop. And for a period of 2 or 3 years, there were only 1 or 2 managerial changes. And by the time those 3 years went by, baseball's a short memory. Ruth hasn't managed for long. He just hasn't been in the thing. It was too late, so they just forgot him. It's too bad. He would have been fun as a manager. Ted Williams managed. Yes?
That would be a nice segue to that. I remember reading that Ted Williams, I guess on trips down to spring training, would search out old-time ball players like the great hitters.
Yeah.
Would talk to Ty Cobb a lot. One guy he never got to talk to was Joe Jackson. And I always remember reading that Babe Ruth copied his swing, Jackson's swing, and then to follow that up, did any players later on come and seek Ruth's, advice or talk to him about hitting?
I don't know if they, the ball players always talk.
Yeah.
But anyone actually sought his advice, I don't know. But the thing about Joe Jackson is interesting. This was one of baseball's chivalrous. Ruth patterned his swing after Joe Jackson. Was a free swinger in the days when most people batted like Ty Cobb. But when he hit that first home run in his first game in baseball, the story said he's a big youngster with a very loose swing, much like Joe Jackson's, whom he'd never seen play at that point. So I don't know, maybe later on he did adapt some things. Ty Cobb had a theory about Ruth. He said Ruth pitched in 1914, 15, 16, 17, and 18 is when he switched over. So he had 4 years, 3 of them in the majors, where Cobb said he could experiment. He could take that big swing. It didn't matter if he struck out. In those days, it was a disgrace to strike out. That's why the strikeout totals, batters totals were so low, and people like Walter Johnson had relatively low strikeout totals compared to Nolan Ryan. But Ruth didn't worry about that. He could swing big, and if he missed, no one really minded, just a pitcher. And by the time he was began playing all the time, he had control of the swing. He could do what he wanted. So that's a theory. Yes?
I read, last summer, I think Alexander was about a book on Ty Cobb,
Yeah.
Charles Alexander. And by any standards of that period or today, Cobb was a pretty miserable human being in so many ways, the opposite of what you're saying about Ruth. How did those guys intersect and interact with each other when their paths crossed?
They didn't like each other. Cobb, first of all, Cobb was the dominant player in baseball from 1906 or 7 through 1920. Ruth was a dominant player from 1920 on, and Ruth changed baseball. Cobb's strength was punching the ball, hitting. He could hit for distance, but it was putting the ball into play and running in the bases, that kind of baseball. Ruth changed the pattern completely, so that in a very short time, everybody was swinging for home runs. Cobb didn't like Ruth. He'd call them names, terrible names, and stupid things, something smell around here, things like that. And I don't know if they ever actually had a fight, but they came close to it once or twice. After they retired from baseball, they had sort of an amicable friendship. They played a golf match during the war for charity and things like that. But when they were playing, they didn't care for each other at all. And nobody liked Ty Cobb. So I'm sorry, one more thing. Ruth didn't give people advice, but everybody started copying the way he swung. I mean, they held the ball back down at the bottom, and home run totals went up like that very quickly, and stayed up there ever since. Yes, Fred, how long should we go on with this? I'll stay. That's why I try to make these notes, because you can't stop talking about it.
You're pretty generous. I think we should thank you and let you go.
I think it's
Bob, was there any pitches that Ruth couldn't hit? Bob, was there any pitches that Ruth couldn't hit?
He was a dynamic pitcher. This is one play.
Oh, it's a secret.
This was, go to this picture. Oh, good. He played the outfield part of the time, but not all of the time. That's what I got from.
Hey, right.
Okay.
It was a pleasure.